Hello, it's the Patriotic Christian here. I'm back and I'm here to talk about everyone's favorite topic, especially this time of year. Taxes. I'm just kidding. Nobody likes taxes, right? But I think it's understandably confusing to a lot of people, especially when you get into, whether taxes are good or bad, or, which taxes are good and all this stuff. It gets very confusing very quick. And it's very easy for many to sort of walk away with the impression that the only objection people have is based on their personal preferences. But what I would like to do today is explain to you the principle on which you can determine whether or not a tax is legitimate or illegitimate. So here I have some simple illustrations that will hopefully help you in understanding. So I hope you've watched my previous video, particularly about rights. It's called Rights Explained because I'm kind of building off of that. A lot of what I do from now on will be building off of that. So you understand the idea of you have individuals, and these individuals have individual rights, and they delegate that to government for their own protection and benefit. So that's what this diagram means. Now, taxes is how you fund the government. And the basic idea of taxes is, each individual contributes a little bit, and, the group funding will fund the government. And so that's the basic understanding, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if you do have a legitimate service being done, you should pay for it, But, sometimes there are people who object to the taxes. Right? And I sympathize with tax objectors and tax evaders because there's a lot of reasons too. But on the most basic level, if you think about it, if a couple people here decide, we're going to opt out. We're not going to pay taxes, okay? Because we don't like this or that or whatever. And if you think about it, if the government is legitimate, and it's doing legitimate things that a government can legitimately do because it's something that individuals have delegated to government to do, then if someone opts out of paying it, what's really going on, because the government doesn't go away, right? I mean, the government is still there, and the people that opt out still benefit from what the government does. People who choose not to pay taxes still benefit from the stability of national security. We don't have to worry about foreign power moving in, conquering, or pillaging our villages, right? So, we benefit from the government, even if we're not contributing to it. Now, what this does, though, is it actually puts the burden of funding on everyone who's not objecting to paying it, right? So, what it really amounts to is, the funding for the government doesn't decrease just because a few people decide to stop paying. What happens is, the people who are paying will have to pay a little bit more to keep it funded. And so what was really going on in a case like this, when you're talking about a legitimate government doing legitimate functions, if you have people objecting simply because, maybe they're just stingy, whatever, they are in a sense stealing from everyone else because they're benefiting from the same services, but they're not contributing. I would as an example, say you and 10 friends decide you want to go out to eat, okay? And so 9 of you vote to go to McDonald's, and 1 of you votes to go to Burger King. Okay, well, after you go to McDonald's, obviously, because if 9 of you voted for McDonald's, that's probably where you're going, the one who voted for Burger King objects and says, you know what? This isn't fair because I don't approve of our eating at McDonald's. So I think it's only right if the 9 of you divide up my bill and pay for it for me. Now, it's one thing if they volunteered to do that, right? But if he goes and he just kind of imposes that on the group simply because he didn't want to go to eat at McDonald's. He did have options. He could have not gone with the group. He could have gone to Burger King by himself. He could have found a new set of friends that liked Burger King. And so this is kind of the example. It's not right for someone to force everyone to pay for them. That's a form of theft. And it's the same thing with government. If you really object that strongly to your government, then you should leave, the country, you know. Go to a country that better suits you. I don't think you're going to find one in reality. But that's the basic principle of government and taxes in general. Now, of course, it's not that simple though, right? We all know there's some added complications. So first I wanted to explain how, it works in a legitimate government. Okay, any kind of legitimate government, it could be achieved in any number of different ways, but you would have legitimate taxes in a legitimate government, obviously, because the taxes are going to fund the government doing its legitimate functions. Okay, and of course it starts with the people, and the people retain their rights, and they would be delegating to the government, right? Now the government then has these legitimate functions to perform. Okay, so in order to perform these legitimate functions, it's going to need taxes. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is, okay? So it has to be funded, and we the people are responsible for the funding because it's our government. Now, there are two criteria to make sure that a government is operating legitimately, okay? The one is it has to be doing legitimate functions. This means it cannot be doing things that individuals cannot do for themselves. If a government is doing things for you that require it to take from one person in order to give it to you, that's illegitimate because you don't have the right to go and take from this person yourself. Therefore, you don't have the right to have government do it for you. So that would be an example of an illegitimate, but a legitimate government does legitimate functions, okay? But that's not all, because just because an individual can do something for themselves doesn't automatically mean government can do that as well, okay? They need authorization, okay? A government has to be authorized by the people in order to perform a legitimate function. Now, of course, with that caveat, you can't legitimately authorize the government to do something that you can't legitimately do, again. Okay, so it has to be both. It has to be both a legitimate function and the government must have received authorization. Okay, now here in the United States, that comes in the form of the Constitution. The Constitution is the set of rules that tell the government what we've delegated to them to do and even a few things that we've specifically prohibited government from doing. Okay, so when you hear people talk about such and such being unconstitutional, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about we the people did not authorize government to do this. It doesn't matter if it could potentially be a legitimate function. If they haven't been authorized to do it, they're not supposed to do it. It's quite simple, right? So that's how it works, is when you've got the people that create the government, they would have legitimate functions, which they've received authorization to do, and then of course they can put it into action. And that would be how it's legitimate. Now, where it gets really fun, of course, is dealing with the illegitimate, right? Because this is what you're all watching the video for, I'm pretty sure. Now, illegitimate taxes. So I'm going to start by saying that if a government is illegitimate, in other words, a government that doesn't derive its just powers from the consent of the governed, as our Declaration of Independence so eloquently says, then it's automatically an illegitimate government. It's just one gang or group of people or even an individual who managed to, gain power and control over everyone. That's not legitimate because it requires trampling on other people's rights to get to power. So when you have a legitimate or an illegitimate government, everything it does is illegitimate. All the taxes are illegitimate, all the functions are illegitimate because of that. Now, supposing we have, though, a legitimate government, and I've got this written down, black for legitimate, red for illegitimate, to sort of make it easier to understand. But suppose you start out with a legitimate government, but the government decides to take illegitimate actions. Okay, again, this is anything that a government does which an individual may not do for themselves. Okay, that would be in the illegitimate category, whatever it would be. So if a government is doing illegitimate actions, then any funding it collects from people to fund that is an illegitimate tax. Okay, it's, if their function is illegitimate, then the taxes are automatically illegitimate. And so that's how that works. Now, over here on the bottom line, got a little bit different scenario. So you've got government. Again, this is a legitimate government. Okay, it's been created by the people. They've delegated certain responsibilities to this government legitimately. And here's you have the government doing something that's potentially legitimate. Okay, so something that people can rightfully do for themselves. And so then they could therefore potentially delegate that to government to do. But in this example, you would have a situation where, but it's not authorized, okay? So if the people don't authorize it properly, then it becomes illegitimate. Even though the function itself would not necessarily be illegitimate, it's more about the process. If they haven't received authorization, then the government's gone rogue. It's no longer deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. And it's not just consent of the governed. It does say just, and that's there for a reason, because it has to be both just and by consent. Now, a good example of this would be, what was a very popular topic several years ago, healthcare, right? I mean, as an individual, you do have the right to provide your own healthcare. I mean, of course you do, right? Therefore, you could potentially legitimately have a government service do that for you, right? I mean, that's potentially, I mean, it's something you can do for yourself. Therefore, if you wanted to create a government agency that, works like an insurance program, so to speak, where you pay into it, and then when the time comes, you get your health care, that's potentially legitimate. But the problem we ran into is that in our Constitution, that is not something the government is authorized to do. And so it becomes illegitimate. So when the government comes in and starts, forcing you to buy health insurance, it's wrong because it never got authorization to do that. It's just doing it, operating rogue, and it's, collecting the funds and it's funding this big program, but it was never legitimate to begin with. So that would be, if you're evading those taxes, you're a legitimate tax evader because the tax is illegitimate. But if, of course, going back to the first example, if you're evading legitimate taxes that you benefit from those services, then you are the one in the wrong because you are robbing your neighbor by making them pay for things that you benefit from. You're just not willing to pay your own bills. If you have a water bill, you have to pay it because it's, you're using the water, you should pay the bill. It's that simple. With rights come responsibilities. And so, yeah, I hope that clears up some things because, a lot of people, they understand this instinctively, but don't always explain it very well, especially to others. And it's very easy for people to get very confused about this and just kind of, start thinking like, well, that's just your opinion. You don't like this or that, and that's your opinion, whatever. But no, there are actually objective principles that you can base this stuff on. And when you really think about it, you'll definitely understand and hopefully agree. So hopefully I'll see you on the next video.